Hello, dear friends. Today I'm going to show you a video about the CYPRESS-AJV Schema Validator and how you can use it in your Cypress projects to perform a schema validation for your APIs. Before, we are going to see what are JSON schemas and what are they used for. According to the JSON Schema organization, JSON Schema is a declarative language for defining structure and constraints for JSON data. JSON Schema offers a formal blueprint for structuring JSON data used in APIs. This specification is crucial for validating the data exchange between servers and clients, ensuring it conforms to anticipated formats. JSON Schema also functions as documentation, clearly detailing the types, formats, and restrictions of the data involved in API interactions. This facilitates seamless integration for developers, minimizing errors and misunderstandings. An OpenAPI document is a single JSON or YAML document that conforms the OpenAPI specification. It incorporates JSON schema for defining data structure within APIs. The OpenAPI specification, formerly Swagger specification, are schema documents to describe your entire API specification. It contains multiple schemas definitions, one for each supported combination of endpoint, method, and status. This is also called path. Swagger 2.0 is another version of OpenAPI 3. This is an example of OpenAPI file. At the top includes the version of the OpenAPI, information about the API, and a section called paths. Each path is the combination of the endpoint, the method, and the status, and indicates what is the schema expected for the response. The schema could be a plain JSON object, but also could be a reference to the component's schema. This definition is like a type that will contain the JSON schema details. And what is CYPRESS-AJV Schema Validator? It's an open source JSON Schema Validator plugin for Cypress. Definitely is your ultimate vigilante for your API schemas. It leverages the capabilities of the AJV plugin and supports JSON Schema and OpenAPI 3 and Swagger 2 documents. The results are provided in a comprehensive and user-friendly way, and also seamlessly integrate with Balmutok CYAPI and cypress-plugin-api. It is available in GitHub and npm. Now we are going to see how we can install and configure CYPRESS-AJV Schema Validator plugin in Cypress. First, we start with a brand new npm project. And we are going to install Cypress as a dev dependency. If we check the package.json, we can see it was installed the latest version. Next, we are going to open the Cypress runner. We are going to select E2A testing and hit continue. So all these resources are going to be created by default. We're going to close it. Next, we are going to edit the Cypress config.js. We are going to configure the viewports and also the base URL that we are going to use in one of our Cypress tests. I also like to configure the file gitignore to ignore the node modules and all the other Cypress folders that create after a run. We are going to install the CYPRESS-AJV-SCHEMA Validator also as a dev dependency. We can see it was installed in the package.json. And last, we are going to include in our command.js file the import of the CYPRESS-AJV Schema Validator so we can use across all our subtests. You can also include it in the E2A.js. Before we write our first test, we're going to have a look to the plugin API. The detailed API reference is available in the plugin's GitHub project. The plugin has one custom command called validate schema with two parameters. The first parameter, schema, is mandatory and is an object with the schema to validate. It can be a plain JSON schema, a Swagger, or an OpenAPI document. The second parameter is path and is optional and is an object with the path to the schema definition within the Swagger or the OpenAPI document. The parameter path is only valid when you are going to process a Swagger or an OpenAPI document. A path consists of three fields. The first is endpoint. That represents the endpoint that you are going to call in your API request. The method that could be get, post, and if not specified, is going to be considered get. And the status, that is the response status that will be expected by your API call. And if not provided, is going to default to 200. The combination of the three of them will determine the expected schema for that API call. Let's write our first test that is going to be using a plain JSON schema. Our first test is going to call to a public API that providing a zip code, it gives you information about that zip code. So our test is going to check that provided data is matching the expected schema. We are going to store our schema inside the folders fixtures schemas. And this is going to be a plain JSON schema with the expected structure for the API call that we are going to call in our test. And we are going to place our test inside the E2E folder. Let's have a look to this test. We created a script that's going to be our first JSON schema test suite. And it's going to consist in two tests. The first test is going to pass. So we are going to call the API and then we are going to validate with the schema. This API call is going to report output that we saw before that is correct. But we are going to write a second test that is going to fail. In this test, we're going to request a call to the same API, but we are going to modify the response body, and we are going to change the country abbreviation property that was US to the number 1. So we are changing from unexpected string to returning a number 1. And then we are going to validate that response that has been modified with the schema. Let's now run our tests. We are going to run the new file we just created. And you can see that the first test pass and the second test fail. When the test pass, the Cypress log showed a message: pass, the response body is valid against the schema. When the Cypress test failed, it gives you a message telling you that response body is not valid with a number of schema errors and a list of all those schema errors. In this case, it's only one. If we check the error with detail, in the log says that the country abbreviation must be a string. Remember that we change in the data the field from a string to a number? So here is complaining that it's not a valid type. However, I have noticed that these messages as provided by the AJV Schema Validator are not easy to understand by most testers. So I decided to implement an improvement. So if we open the browser and we click in the issue, it tells you the mismatches directly on the object that we receive. This is the data that we receive from the API call, where we modify the country abbreviation. And notice here that it's telling you exactly where and what is the issue. It says that the data 1 must be a string. That is what is expected by the schema. For our second group of tests, we are going to call an API, which schema is an OpenAPI document. Let's have a look to the OpenAPI schema. You can see that the schema includes multiple services and the methods and responses. But notice also that the responses that they could have on a schema is not just the 200. It could be also error schemas. And this is very important because you can test responses when the response is an error and you want to be sure that it's returning the right type of error. For example, in this one, the error response must be an object with property code that is an integer and a message string. Let's focus in the two tests that we are going to be seeing for this example. We are going to check the response of the API call to service, the method get, and the response 200. The schema for this response is expected to be a service one response. Let's have a look to the components. In the components, the detail schema includes an ID that must be a UUID, a name that is a string, a status, also a string, an email that is a string but need to follow the format email, created at, a string, is active a boolean, age integer, tags an array, and preference is actually going to be an object of type preferences. Also notice that is required the field ID, name, status, created at, active, and age. And remember created at, because in our example, we are going to remove this field from the response. The other service that we are going to check is going to be the post service for service one, and we are going to check the error response 401. We are going to mock the response for those two API requests. One is going to be the get. So we create an object with the response that is going to return status 200, the headers, and then the body. It's going to have an ID, a name, but look that here name is null, but it's expected a string and is a mandatory. It also have an email, but this is an invalid email because it's expected an email format. Also, the tags are expected to be strings, but the second tag here is an integer. And in preference object notifications is expected to be a boolean, but we are changing here in the mock to be yes, the string yes. Let's have a look now to the second mock data. This is the response for the 401. The status, we have the headers, and then code is a number, and message we have in the mock as null. But remember that in our spec is expected to be a string and to be mandatory. And how are we going to mock those responses? There are many ways you can mock responses, and there are great libraries for that. Some of those are Mockun, Mock Service Worker, Mirage.js, or Knock. But this is not the intent of this tutorial. So what I'm going to do is just a simple trick. I'm going to create a custom command. I'm going to call it request mock. It's going to receive a method get and a URL. Although this is not really going to be a URL. This URL is going to be the path to a feature file. The expected name of the feature file is going to be the URL we pass, and then we concat the method in uppercase. So it's going to be coming to look for fixtures, mock data, OpenAPI, service one schema, fail, and get. That is the command. But also we are going to use to load the post failure. Then our command is going to read the feature and it's going to log in the Cypress log the data that we just read from the feature that we are mocking and returning the response in a shareable with cy.wrap. What is going to look like our tests? First, we are going to import and load the schema definition and put it in the schema variable. The first test is gonna fail. We are gonna check an OpenAPI schema for the service 1, method get, and 200. So we are gonna call our request mock custom command for the method get, and we are gonna pass the path to the fixture that includes the request that fails. And then we are gonna validate that response against our schema, and we are telling our validator that need to validate the entry, the schema for service 1, method get, and status 200. The second test that we are going to create also is gonna fail. This case is gonna be for service 1 endpoint, method post, and response 401. Similarly, we call the request mock for the method post. We provide the path to the mock response that failed, and we are gonna validate against our schema the schema pointed out in our OpenAPI document by service 1, post, and status 401. Let's run our test. We are gonna run the test name test OpenAPI schema. Let's have a look. As expected, those two tests failed. Let's see the first one. It's telling here that there are 5 errors, and we can try to interpret these AJV errors. But remember, we can just open our browser, click in the error, and in mismatches in data, we can see all the details. Let's analyze the response. It says that in the obtained body, the file created at is missing. Remember that we removed that field from the mock data. Email is an invalid format. Name is null but must be a string. Notifications is the string yes but should be a boolean. And tags, the second tag, it contains a number 2 but must be a string. Let's have a look to the second test, the one for the 401 response. In this one also, it's telling us that the property message is null but must be a string, and remember it was a required field. So the CYPRESS-AJV schema validator identify all the errors that happen in our schemas, in our response when we confront with our schema, and it shows up in the browser console those results in a user-friendly way. One of the cool features included in the last release of the plugin was the full integration with the cy.api command with Gleb's Bamutov cy.api and Philips cypress-plugin-api. In our next test, we are going to check the Swagger pet store API. Specifically, the endpoint pen find by status and the method get that must return a list of pets that met the status passed as a parameter. You can get the JSON object with the specification by clicking here. This is a Swagger document, and you can just copy this Swagger specification to a feature file in your Cypress project. So we have copied our schema document in a fixture that will allow us to change some fields and provoke errors when we are analyzing that schema in our tests. So for the service find status, get and response 200 is going to expect a schema of type pet. Let's find the definition. So pet is an object with required name, photo URLs, and age. The field ID originally was an integer, but I have changed to string. There are also other changes that I have made to this schema to provoke some errors. Next, we are going to create a test. Next, we are going to create a test. This test is going to call the method get for find by status service endpoint. We provide the headers, and we are going to call with the Cypress command cy request. And we are going to check the response obtained with the schema that we are expecting. The schema is stored in the pet store schema variable, and we are going to validate, indicating the endpoint pet find by status method get and status 200. Let's run the test. We are running the suite test pet store with cy request. We get the result of the validation that has plenty of errors. There are 22 more errors besides what you show in the Cypress log. And we can check which errors are those in the browser console, as we saw before. So we see here that the field age was removed. The color also was removed. That the field ID, that is 90, might be a string, among many other errors. But what if we can check where the error exactly happened in the response body directly in the user interface, so we don't have to open the browser console? There are two great plugins that can really help you when you are testing APIs in Cypress. They both can show the request and the responses information directly in the Cypress console. One of them is Glebs, and the plugin name is Bamutov/CYAPI, and the other is Philips Cypress-plugin-api. When you run the tests, the requests and the results are shown directly in the user interface, so it will allow you to see directly what you get from those requests. We are going to install both plugins. and they show up in the package.json, one as dev dependencies and the other just directly in dependencies. Now we are going to modify our existing test, and instead of use the command cy_request, we are going to use the cy_api. For that, we import the plugin. In this case is Bamutov cy_api, and we replace the request with cy_api. And similar, we are going to do with the other plugin. We import cypress-plugin-api from Philips, and the request with this command cy_api. Notice that for both libraries, they both call the same command cy_api. So you cannot have actually both of them working at the same time in the same test. Next, we are going to run those tests. We are going to run gleb's API first. And it shows the same errors in the log. But notice that on the right in the user interface, it shows you the request and the response. But we still need to click it here to see what those errors are. Similar with Philips command. It looks different, but also you have here the request and the response. But what if we can show here directly in the object those errors, so I don't have to open the browser console? The CYPRESS-AJV-SCHEMA Validator includes an environment variable called enable mismatches on UI that if you set to true, it will show in gleb's and Philips cy_api commands those errors directly in the user interface. There are different ways that you can set an environment variable in Cypress. One is you could include in the Cypress config.js in the env property. You also can pass as an env parameter in the click command. Another way is just created a Cypress end.json file and add it there. This is what we are going to do. And in this file, we are going to add enable mismatches on UI to true. And we are going to run the Cypress test again. We are going to run first gleb's cy_api. The results are shown in the log as before. They are also available in the browser console, but look at here on the right in the user interface directly over the response. The plugin pointed out exactly where the error and what the error is for each of the records obtained in the response. Here, for example, ID has a value 90, but is expected to be a string, or the color field is missing. Let's see what it looks like integration of CYPRESS-AJV-SCHEMA Validator with Philips cypress-plugin-api. It shows exactly the same information. Age is a missing property, same as color, and the ID 90 must be a string. This is a very convenient and user-friendly way to know what is going on, and in your response, what exactly is not matching with the expected schema. In one of the latest releases of the CYPRESS-AJV Schema Validator, I introduced a very interesting feature that was proposed by Murad Özkan. That feature is disabling the schema validation in your tests. Think about this use case. We have all these tests where we are API testing and including in the API testing the schema validation. But let's say that the schema is pretty messed up and we want to disable temporary until we fix it. But we still want to do all the other API testing that we have included in our test. For that, I introduce a new environment variable called disable schema validation. When we set this property to true, it's going to disable all the schema validations made by our Cypress command across your whole Cypress framework. Let's just run the test. Now when we run our tests, they are not going to fail because of schema validation, and it's going to show in the Cypress log a message saying that the schema validation is disabled in yellow. So you can have all your other assertions here, and also at the same time, pause for now the schema validation, and the only thing you need to do to enable across your test is setting this variable disable schema validation to false or simply removing. All the examples and schemas used in the video tutorial are available in GitHub in the repo Cypress-AJV Schema Validator sample project. Also, there is a number of articles and videos about this plugin. In one of the blogs, Cypress includes the Cypress-AJV Schema Validator as one of the top 10 essential plugins for your Cypress project. If you want to know more, you can find me in LinkedIn, Dev2, GitHub, NPM, my personal website, and also in my new YouTube channel, Sebastián Clavijo Suero, and also in the Cypress Discord.